Hey, what's good, Colorado? Aaron Johnson coming to you here from Mile High Live to talk to you today about the potential of Colorado getting a new national park. And this is a topic that is bittersweet to talk about when it's something that is rooted in the history of our state, but is vitally important for us to recognize. And what I'm talking about is Camp Amache, which is out near Granada, Colorado, out on the eastern plains of our state. And in World War II, Camp Amache was an internment camp that housed tens of thousands of Japanese Americans, people just like you and me, families who lived throughout the country. A lot came from California and were housed for 3 years in the internment camp. And this, of course, stems from the fear during that era following the bombing of Pearl Harbor by Japan and the U.S. response to that in the lead up to and during World War II. And Camp Amache is something that I'm familiar with through different interests and work that I've had over the last decade, although I have yet to visit it and very much wish to do so. But it began in 1942 when President Roosevelt signed an executive order to basically create these camps across the West. There's Amache, there's one in Idaho, Wyoming, Utah, and many others across the country, where hundreds of thousands of Japanese Americans were ordered to move to. And we often use the term internment camp to describe them. However, they're also called prison camps, and they're called concentration camps. And different people have different terminologies for them, but I think you could say that there is good reason for any of those. And I think that this is an important moment for us to recognize, and that there is action to progress, to move towards designating that property as the next, the next property within the National Park Service. And this happened last week. The U.S. House of Representatives in Washington voted on a bill that was introduced by Colorado Congressman Neguse from Boulder, and it was also co-sponsored by Representative Buck, who represents the Eastern Plains. And I'm going to pause and just say that, politics is a personal passion of mine. However, big part of why I have started this channel is because I want to talk about something different than politics. And I think there's a lot of discussion about it, and that's healthy in a lot of ways. But in other ways, it has become so negative, and we can't have a conversation about public policy without people going to, I'm sorry to say, their different camps, whether it's Camp Red or Camp Blue, Team Red, Team Blue, whatever it is. And it's hard to have a conversation about it. But I think what we've seen here in this legislation to consider making Camp Amache, the internment camp outside of Granada, Colorado, a national park, is bipartisanship in Washington. The fact that only 2 members of the U.S. House of Representatives, out of more than 400 who voted for it, only 2 voted against it. This has incredible bipartisan support. And I think that goes to show one, the importance of recognizing these grounds for what they are, and 2, that there is still opportunity for our lawmakers to come together in a bipartisan way. And we don't see that or hear about that often enough. So I wanted to share that news about the bill because of that as well. But Camp Amache is important to Colorado history for a lot of reasons, and I will just briefly touch on that. But there's so much available to learn online about this and different sources. But first, I'd point you to the Colorado History Museum that has a display about Camp Amache that is really important. And here's a sign that hangs just out front of that property to give you a glimpse. Not just at the museum, but there's a really fascinating podcast that the Colorado History Museum did last year. I believe that it was done. And it's called Behind Barbed Wire. And I love this for a lot of reasons. It was very educational, very informative, going into the history of not just Camp Amache, but the movement to intern Japanese Americans and how that came about, what that looked like, and what it looked like for those people who were living behind the barbed wire. And as they say in there, how they were told they were being put in there for their protection. But one of the things that stood out to me was, well, why were the guard towers facing in and not out if it was for their protection from outsiders? But the reason that this podcast was done as well was to highlight the history of Bonsai in the camp. And Bonsai is something that I'm into, I love, and it turns out that there's actually a very rich history here in Colorado, a very landlocked state to this art form, and specifically Camp Amache. And in fact, during World War II, it's believed that at Camp Amache, the only bonsai show where they would have these trees designed, sculpted, were on display. So not even in Japan did they have then, according to the podcast, bonsai shows where these were on display. Of course, the country was at war and in turmoil. But I think that it goes to show part of the significance of this camp and what it means for a lot of reasons. The history of Colorado and the context of the war in our broader culture. And I think it would be a very fascinating place. I talked in my previous segment about getting out and enjoying public lands. It's something I love to do, getting out on the trail and hiking around. However, if Camp Amache were to become a national park, and this legislation from Congressman Neguse and Congressman Buck were to move forward and get final passage, approved by the Senate and then signed by President Biden, that it would be a very different experience than going to Mesa Verde, going to Rocky Mountain National Park, or the Great Sand Dunes. This would be much more hollow national park, more so than recreation. So I'm curious to see how this legislation moves forward. The support for it, and this has been discussed for many years. So glad to finally see that there is some action in the House on this just last week. But again, Camp Amache, let me show the sign there. And I have another as well. This sign here, just out front, directing people off the main highway, Highway 50 here. As you can see, there's not a whole lot there. There's a cemetery that's kept up by local community, by high school students that do projects to help keep this up. But if we could put the power of the National Park Service behind keeping this up and bringing some of that history to life would be incredibly valuable for remembering what happened, and again, just the importance of that time and where Colorado stood in that place. And something that I've learned, I didn't necessarily learn this so much in school, but something that I've learned later on is how Colorado actually, before the internment camp, was so welcoming to Japanese Americans, and that Governor Carr, C-A-R-R, was trying to help bring Japanese Americans to Colorado to live in and around Denver before the internment camps were started by President Roosevelt. So very important, but something that we don't talk enough about here in our state. So I'll leave it with that, but I thought it was very good news to hear, and something that I wanted to share here as we, just getting on the heels of talking about getting in the outdoors and going hiking and enjoying our public lands. But our public lands here in Colorado can offer so much besides just recreation. So with that, I'm Aaron Johnson for Mile High Life. Thank you for taking a few minutes to tune in. If you like what you see, please hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. You know what to do. You hear it all over, and appreciate you tuning in to Mile High Life.